Welcome to FP&A Fast Track, your source for FP&A resources to put your career on the fast track. Welcome, everybody. I have a great guest with me here today. I have actually the FP&A Guy, Paul Barnhurst, with me here today. Paul's passionate about helping others learn and become better FP&A and finance professionals, as am I. And Paul, you've got your mitts into so many different things. I'm going to kick it over to you to take that brief intro. Tell us a little bit about what are the things that are top of mind of all the different things that you have going on, and who are you working with today? I know it's FP&A professionals, but you do so many things. Give us your quick
Yeah,
hot take.
so let me give a little bit an overview. So first, I do a few podcasts. I know you do one yourself. So I have what's called FP&A Today, and that's all about financial planning analysis. We release weekly episodes. Really enjoy doing that. We've done about 90 episodes there. And then I launched last summer, a show called Financial Modelers Corner. And so that focuses just on financial modeling and brings in stories from modelers around the globe. So I have the podcast side of my business, and then I do a fair amount of training. I have a great partner out of Canada, Ron Montero, who spent his career at FP&A, and together we do data visualization, storytelling, Excel, an FP&A course. We just wrapped one up about an hour ago today. We wrapped up the fourth session of our virtual course. We do it every other month, and we talk about FP&A. So that's a big part of it. Then beyond that, I do quite a bit with vendors, from educational content where they may sponsor webinars and different things with them, as well as a lot of research in the software space for FP&A tools. I've seen demos now of, I don't know, probably 100 tools, somewhere in that ballpark, more than I care to count. I've talked to 60, 70 CEOs. I've put out a market guide last year about these newer tools, and my new market guide is with the publisher right now. We're just getting final feedback and making a few little tweaks, and should be publishing that here sometime soon.
Awesome. So I want to backtrack a little bit just to give the viewers a little bit of context. So Paul and I actually met last October, not actually at the FP&A at the AFP conference, but at a dinner that Christian Wadig invited me to, where there was a kind of a gang of folks, several of which you co-presented with a session that you did at the AFP conference. But you were on the opposite end of the table. So I actually
Yes.
barely got to talk to you. So we actually haven't had a chance to talk a whole lot, but I have been following your LinkedIn. So for those of you that are not yet following Paul, we'll get into some of the stuff that you have in terms of the training that you provide. But Paul shares a ton of free stuff on LinkedIn, on his podcast, and in lots of other areas. So definitely tune into that stuff. I want to get a little bit of background for context. So one of the questions I love to ask people is, I'm big on trying to connect dots. And I'm curious, when you were a kid and you were thinking about what you wanted to be when you grew up, what did you want to be? And is there any connection whatsoever between that and what you're doing today?
Yeah. So we'll start when I was a little kid. I did a newspaper route for 5, 6 years. I love sports. And one of the things I would always do before I delivered the papers is I'd open one and read the sports section, and often read the box scores. I loved numbers. I could memorize, okay, John Stockton, my favorite player, averaged 14 points this year and 13.8 assists or whatever, like that, those type of details. And so I remember memorizing all the details. For some reason, I thought I wanted to be a statistician. That wasn't the case when I took my first stats class, but that's another story. I've always had a love of numbers. And then in high school, I took my first business class, and I wrote an entrepreneurship. It was an entrepreneurship class, wrote a business plan. I did it again the next year. Actually got to compete in a national competition in Detroit for that. I placed in state. And so that's when I knew I wanted to do something in business, not necessarily FP&A. I didn't get into FP&A till after grad school, when I did a finance specialization. Undergrad, I did an entrepreneurship specialization. But I guess what I'm doing today, in the sense of running my own business, since entrepreneurship, I've always wanted to do my own business. So I guess ultimately I am doing what I wanted, not so much as a kid, but in high school, those ideas really started to come to me. It'd be fun to run my own business one day.
Interesting. So we have a little bit in common in that when I was a kid, I thought I wanted to have my own business, but I didn't actually have the vaguest clue what that meant. I
Yeah.
just thought both my parents, so my dad was in the Army for 30 years. My mom worked for civil service. So they both worked for the government. So all government jobs have a pretty rigid promotion structure, right? And
Yep.
so I
Mhm.
loved a lot of stuff about the military, but that always seemed to me like a big negative because I look at my parents and think they're smart and they're hardworking, but they can only advance within that rigid structure. And that really
Yes.
was the first thing that made me think I wanted to have my own business. And then, of course, you like rich people in the media, you think, oh, they've got all the cool stuff. But I didn't have a clue what that meant. So I did get interested in taking business classes, but I ended up getting a degree in accounting and actually didn't really love accounting. But when I transitioned into FP&A, that's when I had a little bit more of an aha and I went, "Oh, this is much cooler. This isn't about reporting on the past. This is about looking forward and analyzing things, trying to literally I've always looked at it like we're really gambling just with much better data than normal gambling, right? When we do a
Mhm.
forecast, when we put together a budget, it's our best guess and sometimes we're hoping and wishing. Obviously, hope is not a strategy, but I always looked at it as being much different from that standpoint, and I enjoyed that part of it a lot more. So, you became an FP&A guy at some point in your finance career. How did you go from being the FP&A practitioner working for a company to being the FP&A guy, the content creator, course creator, podcaster, and that whole sort of media and training part of things?
Yeah. So, it's a fun story. FP&A, I really started my FP&A career. I want to say it was the end of 2009. I did a finance role, a little more reporting about a year and a half later. A true FP&A role came open. I've been doing it ever since. Did it for a few different companies. So what happened is it really started 2016 looking for a job. I was working for American Express supporting travelers checks. Not exactly a growing business. As you've seen the 99% decline from their high of 20 something billion to a lot less than.
I
And
wasn't even aware
so,
they're still around.
yeah, they still when I was last there, they were still selling a decent amount, more than most people would think for sure. And so what happened with that is I was looking for jobs and obviously you get on LinkedIn, you're like, okay, I'll start networking, the typical stuff everybody does. And one of the guys I came across was a guy by the name of Ken Fick. And he was running his own FP&A consulting business. And I reached out to him and I said, hey, if you'll give me 30 minutes of your time, I'll give you a Starbucks gift card. And I remember responded with, he goes, I don't want your gift card. I want you to write an article for my website. Yeah, I suck at writing, but all right, I'll write you an article. And we talked and I wrote him one and he reached back out. He said, hey, I'll give you like $100 for another article if you write me one. And so I wrote him a couple articles and one of them did quite well. And I shared them on LinkedIn and got a number of comments from them. And that led to me doing a little more on LinkedIn. And then there's FP&A Trends, Larissa out
Mhm.
of the UK. She runs that. And she was looking for somebody to help monitor the discussions each week that they had. So I volunteered to do that. And so I was periodically posting my own things there, started to do a few more things on LinkedIn, and over time started to build more and more of a following, but nothing consistent, no plan with it, never thinking it would be a business. Along with that, Larissa started inviting me to a couple different webinars. So I got to know a few people. That's how I got to know Ron Montero and some others and did 2 or 3 webinars and continued to get a little more and more serious about it, more around trying to find a job. And then what happened is I wrote about a couple FP&A tools because I was actually trying to interview with them. I wanted to get a job with them. And all these people started reaching out to me saying, hey, will you look at my tool? Because I wrote about them. And so toward the end of 2021, a company approached me and said, hey, look, if you do a post for us, we'll give you 150 bucks. I'm like, all right, why not? And so that happened. And then about the same time, somebody reached out to me about an opportunity to work part time for somebody. And a couple other people, Ron Montero reached out to me and said, hey, I need someone to design an Excel training course. Would you do that? And a couple vendors in a week period in December of 21, 3 different vendors made me kind of offers. One of them wanted to do a big collaboration. The other 2 talk about potentially hiring me. So I remember I went to my wife at that point and I said, hey, honey, I think I can turn this into a business. And I'd given it some thought before, but that's the first time I broached it. And I think she looked at me like I was crazy going, okay, you have committed $150. You're going to turn this into a business. Like, okay. And so we talked about it. And about 6 weeks later, I remember it was mid February roughly. So this time in 2022, 2 years ago. And I told her, she came to me one day and she goes, all right, if you want to start your business, go for it. I trust you. And so I said to her, I go, are you sure? Because I'm going to put in my notice today. And she's, yeah, I'm sure. And so I put in my notice that day. I didn't get out of there till about 4 months later. I went part time in March of 2022. And that's really how it started, and I had you and just continued to build from there, figure out what I was doing.
That's I find it so interesting how everyone's journey there seems to be no consistency of I had to like, when I started working for myself, I had no business plan for it. I was literally working at AutoNation and got laid off. Like, they shut down the business
Yep.
unit that I was working in, and then
Mhm.
they hired me back as a consultant, and it just went from there, and there's all kinds of bumps
Yep.
along the way. One of the things that you said reminded me of you're talking about American Express and the traveler's checks.
Yeah.
If you think you worked for a business that wasn't growing, I worked for Blockbuster back in the day, but this was back in the '90s when we were the 10-ton gorilla. But
Yep.
I rarely talk about it anymore because if I even say the word Blockbuster, people are like, "Blockbuster? Is that thing even around?" It's such it's
Yeah.
iconic, but it's so far back in history. It was a fun time, though. It was a fun time. But so you do a lot of different things now in the
Mhm.
FP&A world. One of them that I'm a part of that I haven't been very active in it yet, but your Plan Buddies community. Give us a little bit of a flavor for what exactly Plan Buddies is. It's obviously for FP&A people, but what all is in Plan Buddies?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So first, I was really fortunate. I have two partners in that. Laurent Edelist, he has a PhD and he's worked in the FP&A space as a consultant and running one of these companies for software for 20, 30 years. And he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I really think there's an opportunity to create a community here to help people." And I had thought about doing a community before, and I said, "Sure, let's give it a try." We brought in another partner, so there's 3 founders. And really what it is, we look at it as a planning and analytics community. So we do have some salespeople, we have some pricing, more than just FP&A, supply chain,
Okay,
different areas within planning, but the vast majority is FP&A because that's where our audiences come from.
gotcha.
And so within the community, we have a few things that we do. One, discussion. Some people say, "What's the difference between that and LinkedIn?" One, it's curated. You're not going through a feed and seeing all kinds of ads and everything. Two, it's much easier to reach out to those people because they're all in the community. There's no, "Hey, they're a second level connection." You can't reach out to them. So
Right.
one, it's much more intimate on the communication side. In addition to that, we have a number of resources available. I do a brief weekly podcast with that, not even necessarily weekly, but occasional where I interview different guests for 10, 15 minutes. So that's part of it in there. We have a mentoring program where we have people sign up to be mentors and people who want to be mentored. And within the program, you get 4 free mentoring sessions. And after that, it's up to the mentor and mentee to decide what they want to do. People commit. So we have a little bit of a mentoring. We have some networking resources. And then we have quite a few events. We had one today around AI and how to use it, how to think about it. I'm going to start doing one monthly about the new releases and then all the new features in Excel that nobody knows about that have come out over the last few years. So each month I'll go and talk about those. So that's really what the community is. And the biggest thing is so many people have told me I wish I had a resource beyond my boss where I could go and find out how are others doing things. And that's
Mhm.
not really LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn has become very much of a social media and hey, put out a lot of
Yes.
graphics. Everybody says it's wonderful and they comment on it. And you can meet great people. I've had plenty of business opportunities, but you're generally not having deep discussions to figure out how to do things and really get those things that will
Yes.
help you at work from LinkedIn. And we
Yep.
felt that was needed. That was really missing for planning professionals. There's plenty of those for operating professionals and finance in general, but not for planning professionals.
Yeah, we really need someplace we can do the inside baseball conversations, the nerd talk,
Exactly.
the deep dives, the, "Hey, I'm stuck on XYZ. Has anybody else ran into this?" And then you got 5 other people in the group that are going, "I tried this." That kind of stuff is much harder. In theory, I think that's part of what LinkedIn, I think, promised at some point, but it
Yep.
just I think you described it pretty well. It's definitely a social media platform. It's a it's a good place to be, but it's almost to me, I almost look at it like a business card. Like, you have to have it. Everybody exchanges them. They do that,
Yep.
but when it comes to business, just giving out business cards ain't gonna cut it. Just being on
Yeah.
LinkedIn just ain't gonna cut it. You mentioned a couple things that I'd love to get into a little bit more. One of them on all the Excel new releases that you talked about. Dude, you
Mhm.
get so deep into Excel. So back in the day, I was like the go-to Excel person in every company that I worked in. But over the years,
Yep.
as you progress, some people, they
Yep.
take different turns in what they dive deep into, right?
Yeah.
Some people dive deep
Mhm.
into Excel. Some people I got into
Mhm.
M&A and then
Yeah.
eventually got more into the communication and the soft skills side of things. What is it about Excel that excites you so much? Because you seem genuinely like passionate about Excel and all of the nuances of it.
Yeah, I love software in general. I always had. When I did my MBA, I also did a Master of Science in Information Management. I've always been a
Okay.
little bit on the tech side, not a coder. I've never really wanted to learn programming. I know some SQL, I know some M, some DAX, know Excel well. And what I like about Excel is it's incredible what you can do with the tool. What I love is teaching people and helping them realize, oh, I didn't know that. The Excel of today is nothing like the Excel of 10 years ago. Yes, it's a grid.
Yeah.
Yes, it has many of the same functions. But now, soon to come out will be Python. You got Power Query. You can load pretty much any data you want. You got the Power Pivot on the back end. You formulas are dynamic. There's just so much you can do, and people know so little that they're wasting a lot of time. I find myself even doing that now and did something the other day where I'm like, oh, I could just automate this. Why have I been doing it this way for 6 months? And you're like, all right, it's
Yeah.
time to just bite the bullet and do it. And so I think what I enjoy about it is just seeing people realize that they can be so much more efficient in their job if they're willing to invest some time. And that doesn't mean they have to learn to be a coder or an expert in Excel. For many, even just a day, a course or two, learning a few things can make a big difference.
So I see these polls constantly on LinkedIn, and I've seen one or two recently about Excel, but they're typically more about more technical things,
Eh,
Python or Power BI or whatever it
Yep.
might be. And you mentioned AI. I've heard lots of people talk about, hey, I don't need to learn Python when I can get ChatGPT to just write the code that I need for me. If I learn how to do the prompts properly and I learn how to work with I can get around learning that. What are your thoughts on AI, where it fits in to the picture of all the other tools, and your thoughts on the people that say, if I just learn it's a hack to not have to go as deep into learning the intricacies of Excel or Power BI or Python or some of those other things.
Yeah. So, first and foremost, generative AI, right? These big learning models, they're really a productivity tool. I think that's how people need to view them. It's all about being more productive. I use AI almost daily at some level or another.
Same.
Hey, help me rewrite this. Tell me about this. Help me write a formula. So I think everybody needs to learn AI. That being said, yes, it can shortcut some of the learning. It can do things that we may not have to know. But AI will be most dangerous in those that understand the stuff behind it because you still have to be able to validate it. And I'll give an example. I needed to write an indirect formula, and I just don't write them very often. If anyone's done one in Excel, there's a lot of little things you got to get right. Quotes and double quotes and single quotes and exclamation, and they all have to go in the right place
Yeah,
and a
the
bunch of
syntax,
ampersands. So
yep,
it's very syntax heavy. Not complex, but very syntax heavy, right? If you get one
yeah,
thing wrong, the formula doesn't work and you're just going, "Okay, where's my mistake?" And so instead I said, "Forget this." And I just went to Chat GPT and said, "Okay, I'm trying to do this," and did the first section. Then I asked it for the second section and the third and the fourth. There's about 5 or 6 different levels to this one.
mhm,
Took me about 20 minutes and it got all the syntax perfectly right. Now, having the knowledge allowed me to quickly and easily do that. If somebody didn't know even about the
yeah,
formula, a little bit of how they work, they wouldn't have been able to get something that worked as dynamically as I was able to. So I think the more you know, the better you'll be able to use AI. It's not that it won't benefit somebody who doesn't know anything, but generally, I think
yeah,
you need at least enough to validate it and hopefully go a little deeper than that in the subject you're using it for.
yeah. So a few things came to mind as you were describing that. So it reminds me a little bit of you've probably gotten this over your career too. Somebody finds out what you do for a living, and they go, "Oh, you're a finance guy. You must be good at math." Every time somebody found out, "Oh,
Oh,
you're an
never
accountant. You
heard
must be
that.
good at math." And I always used to say to people, especially with respect to accounting, very different from FP&A,
Yes.
accounting's not about math. It's about rules. It's about
Mhm.
understanding how to apply rules to math, but the math part of it is not really that complicated.
No.
But where the understanding comes in that I think You're pulling me around to your point of view on this, actually, which is when I think about people that say, why do I need to learn algebra? I'm not going to be an accountant or an engineer. Guess what? In my opinion, most of us use algebra every single day, whether you think about it or not, because some of the underlying core principles of algebra are something as simple as this is to that as that is to that, right? Some of these properties of algebra that once you understand them, inform your thinking about how things work. And as you were describing, that's exactly what was coming to mind is if you don't understand some of how the things are going on behind the scenes, and additionally, if you don't have that context to understand the output in context of what you're working on, then you're going to be one of those people that copies and pastes and ends up looking like a bonehead because you present something that's not right for the purpose. Part of it's because you didn't understand enough about how the thing works. And then you didn't understand the output in the context of what the answer you were looking for. So interesting. See, I love asking questions like this of people that have an opinion that might be a little different from mine because I have a lot of opinions that I feel strongly about, but they're weakly held. They're strong opinions weakly held, right?
I love that
That
idea. I've heard that concept before, and I think it makes a lot of sense. The strongly
I
held, but really weakly.
I just
Yeah.
don't believe I think I'm an intelligent guy, but I'm certainly not I've certainly not been in a lot of the rooms I've been in, not the most intelligent guy in the room, which has
Oh,
its
yeah.
pros and cons. Early in my career, I felt stupid, but it ended up being great in the long run because I was surrounded by people that I was constantly learning from, constantly taking
Mhm.
notes, asking questions. And I've probably learned more in the hallway after a meeting than in almost anywhere else when I was in meetings with senior people and the fly on the wall and then afterwards asking a lot
Yeah.
of questions. And that makes me wonder, have you had any mentors along the way that have had particularly big impacts on your career?
Yeah, for sure. I think one mentor that really helped me a lot, steered me toward more of the IT and the tech side was when I worked for the government. I started my career in procurement of
Okay.
all things. I was a contract specialist for the government. And we had someone that ran our systems office, and she was really big on the systems and took me under her wings. Her name was Karen Hayden. And I feel like she really helped me get started and gave me a lot of confidence in my career and made sure I was doing the things I wanted to do. And it was great learning from there. And I've had a number of others since then that have been involved in my career and really have been inspirational. Even my business partner I do a lot of training with today, I look at as a mentor, Ron Montero. I've learned so much from him on being better with soft skills and presenting and just how to run a business. So I've been fortunate to have a lot of good mentors over the years.
Yeah. So part of the reason I asked that is because I think part of what you're doing with everything you do, not just Plan Buddies, but your training, your
Mhm.
podcast, in a way, you're being a mentor either directly or indirectly. And I look at it like I'm not a mentor directly for anyone in
Yeah.
what I'm doing, but even something like the podcast is helping curate by having people like yourself on who are experts that can bring something to the table. And even if my only hand in that is bringing you to the table and pulling some of this great information out of you, if somebody's watching this, they get the benefit of that. And that's been a big deal for me because I've only had one or two sort of one-on-one mentors over my entire career. More of it was the indirect through books and podcasts and different things like
Mhm.
that. What you're doing with all the stuff that you do is really important and really necessary. And it, in a way, I think it's near and dear to my heart as well, because I'm one of those people that feels
Yeah, I
like
know
they're
you're
always
doing like
learning.
what you're doing here and other stuff. It's great, whether it's direct or indirect, to be able to help people. To
Yeah.
help them advance and to learn and grow. I get emails all the time for people thanking me for a podcast episode or that they really enjoyed it. And it's just so
Yeah.
rewarding when you see that. It really is.
Yeah. So let's transition a little bit because I wanted to provide some context, let the audience get to know you a little bit as a person, not just the FP&A guy, get a little background. But I also want to touch on some meat and potatoes. So one of the questions that I get all the time is it's typically from accountants. It could be from anyone, but I just get it more from accountants because that was my background before FP&A. And the question
Yep.
usually sounds something like this. Hey, I'm in accounting right now. It might be public accounting, corporate accounting, whatever it is. That FP&A thing looks pretty cool. I don't know how to get into that. Do you have any tips on how I can position myself to transition from some other non FP&A role into FP&A? What would you say to somebody to ask that kind of question?
Yeah. So the first thing, because I mostly get it from accountants as well, is the first thing I tell people is, okay, is that what you want to do? Or are you just looking and, hey, it's an opportunity to get promoted? It's a different role. Because accounting and FP&A are very different, right? Accounting is rule based,
Very.
very
Mm,
structured, very process. FP&A is very much about how you guide the business.
yeah,
And so they really are quite different. So the first thing, usually for someone from accounting, especially if I'm talking to group, is this what you want to do? You really understand what it is. Make sure you know what it is and it fits your personality. Because there are some accountants that are just not cut out for FP&A, and there are FP&A that aren't cut out to be accountants. And the last thing you want
100%.
to
Yeah.
do is invest a bunch of time to find out, oh, I don't like this either, or this wasn't the right move. And then you're like, what do I do next? And the
Right.
example I give is I had a great accountant. He had worked in FP&A before, excellent accountant. I went to one day, I go, "Hey, I have an analyst role open. You interested?" He laughed and looked at me like, "Are you kidding?" I did that fuzzy math for about a year. No thanks. There's no actual answers. Nothing's concrete. You're just making stuff up all day.
Dude, that's
Basically, I'm
such a
like, all
great
right.
that's such a great example because that there are people that they find this divide where the other side just seems like it doesn't make sense. What are you doing over there? Like you said, you're just making numbers up. Wait, I remember when I worked in M&A, we were in a meeting one day. We were almost arguing. It was like a room of 5 guys. We were
Yeah,
almost arguing over what discount rate we should use in the valuation model. And
I
one
could picture that in my mind.
and one of the guys literally said, and pardon my French here, but he's, "Guys, this is a bunch of mental masturbation, right? There's a range of numbers that we've been using for a while. Take one of those numbers and let's roll. Because a lot of there's a bunch of theoretical stuff that we can talk about, but we should be spending a lot more time on understanding the assumptions and getting the assumptions nailed down better than this one number. Although, at the end of the day, that one number could probably have a bigger swing on the valuation than any one other single number.
Sure.
But it's to me, that was a great example of what you're talking about, where a pure accountant might look at that and go, this is such a waste of time. This is just a bunch of you're just guessing, right? And then you get M&A guys that are like, it's not guessing, man. This is a science. And that actually was, so I'll use that example too as another example of where it might not be a bad idea, depending on the situation that you're in, to maybe take a chance. That M&A job I had, I was working in public accounting and just wanted to get out of public accounting. And I saw an ad for an M&A analyst at Blockbuster way back in the 90s when they were growing like wildfire. And I literally applied for the job. This is going to sound so stupid, but I literally applied for the job because I thought M&A sounds cool, right? It just sounded way cooler than auditing and tax.
Mhm.
And then I got the job. It did end up actually being a cool job, but I didn't know it was going to be. I just was rolling the dice. But sometimes in our careers, we don't really know what we want to do. And some of us don't really have a big vision for it. I've fallen into things more by process of elimination, trying things and
Mhm.
going, didn't like that. All right, here's my skill set. What else can I apply that to? Speaking of skill sets, let's talk a little bit about, I know you offer a lot of different things in the training that you do, but if you had to start from the top, think about the 80/20 rule. And if you were mentoring someone in FP&A that was trying to get themselves on the career fast track, what are some of the top skills that you would suggest that they focus on getting better at first?
So I think there's a table stakes level that everybody needs to reach. You got to be able to use spreadsheets, whether it's Excel or Google Sheets. You need to have a good command of that. You need to be able to analyze data, understand modeling, the basics of accounting. But when you hit a certain level, you need to start investing much more of your time in those soft skills if you want to get promoted, right? How do I better communicate? How do I really better visualize the story? Which is, there's some technical and science behind it, no question. But there's a communication element to it. How do I better tell the story? How do I business partner? One that I think is critical, and Carl Simon talks about a lot, is how do I anticipate, right? We did an episode with him called it the Great Anticipator. And I really like that for FP&A, because what we're trying to do is anticipate what's going to happen next and help guide the
Yeah.
business ultimately. Yeah, we call it gambling sometimes or forecasting. And people always say, when I get really close, you're really good at forecasting. No, if I was that good at forecasting, I'd be on a beach right now because I would have made a fortune in the stock market. I got lucky.
Yeah,
I want to
by
be
the way,
directionally correct.
for all those of you out there listening, be really careful to only talk about that in terms of gambling, like within the inside baseball FP&A conversation. We don't
Yes.
wanna be using that kind of terminology when we're talking to people outside of FP. We get it, but
Yeah.
anyway, sorry, I just wanna
Yeah,
interject that.
exactly. So I just like to emphasize that it's about assumptions and strategy. Yes, you need to be directionally correct. And yes, you want to be as
Yeah.
accurate as possible. But it's not about getting to within 0.5% or 1% on a lot of things. It's about, like you said, the M&A, the assumptions, what's important, what's going to drive this decision, what really matters, and do we understand that in a way that we can put together a realistic plan?
Yeah. Speaking of what drives the numbers, when I got into FP&A, so my first FP&A role was after I worked at M&A. And so the first time I heard a conversation where people were talking about driver-based planning, I was scratching my head and going, "What do you mean by that?" And they explained it and I went, "I thought that's how everybody did it." Because in M&A, when you do a valuation model, everything
Mhm.
is going down to the assumption level. What are the drivers? And then building that model up based on all those assumptions and doing your projections that way. So I had not worked in a place that was like a top down, here's the number, just go make it work type of environment. So I'm curious with all the tools now, back in the day to do driver based modeling was way harder than it is today, right? Because you had to build all those relationships from scratch in your formulas in Excel, right? So there would be days that I'd be building a formula and somebody would knock on my door and I'd be like, I had this mile long formula in my head. I've only got half of it on the screen and now I kind of have to start over. But now, even if you're only in Excel, there's so many new formulas that they didn't used to have and new functions, but there are also purpose
Oh.
built planning tools that are out there. So, what are your thoughts on when someone is looking at should I do this in Excel versus a purpose built tool? Do you have any tips on like decision making criteria on when do I take this thing out of Excel?
Yeah, so the way I like to say it is when you're dealing with Excel hell, it's time to move on. And what I mean by that is if the complexity is such that you're linking a bunch of workbooks together, or you're wondering, why don't I have the latest version? You're up all night tying things out. You're really struggling to get the data in cleanly. And it's just becoming a painful exercise. Particularly, there's a few things collaboration. When you start to have a lot of departments and a
Yeah.
lot of people, Excel is not a good collaboration platform. If you're trying to integrate a lot of data, again, it's not great at integrating data. Two, if you want any privacy or any of the database things, it doesn't have that, right? Excel
Mhm.
is not an enterprise grade application. It is the best spreadsheet tool in the world. It is a fabulous tool I think every business should have. And even if you implement a tool, there may be many times in many cases where you're still going to do some of your work outside of the tool in a spreadsheet
Yeah.
because it is one of the most flexible tools in the world. And so I think it's really when you're starting to scale and experiencing all the pain points that are common to Excel, mistakes and different things, that's when you need to start evaluating and saying, does this make sense to continue this way? Or will I get benefit from a tool? And sometimes there's an intermediate where, okay, am I using Excel right with using Power Query and using BI and SharePoint and having somebody with a really good skill set? Can I go a couple more years this way and save $100,000? The answer may very well be yes. And so it's not always one or the other. I think there's a lot of things that can be done with the Microsoft tech stack before you even before getting to the point where, yep, I got to have a tool. There's
Yeah.
pros and cons both ways to that. But
Yeah, one of the things that I've always looked at as the biggest pro and con at the same time, the double-edged sword of Excel is people look at it like a multi-tool, right? I
yep.
can do it in Excel, therefore I will. And then you find yourself, you're like, wait a minute, I built a calendar app in Excel. What am I doing? There's so many millions of things that back in the day we built in Excel just because we could. And it was not the
Mhm.
best tool for it, but it was almost part of being that Excel nerd that we were. almost a little bit just pushing to see how much more we could get out of the darn thing. But that's some good criteria there. The collaboration, the
And one
privacy.
thing I'll add on Excel real quick that I think you'll
Mhm.
find when you said it's the multi-tool. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I saw the image somewhere, and so I kind of recreated a slightly different version of it. And what it was, it had
Mm.
like 20 different applications, like okay, sales commissions, financial modeling, procurement, headcount planning, and all these different things. And it had Excel on every single one of them, and it had second place on every single one of them. It's almost always the second best tool to do something in, and then
Yeah.
it's the lowest cost tool.
Yeah, that brings me to another thing that I think is consistent, not just with Excel and other tools, but I believe that almost always most combination solutions are not the best at any one of the problems that they solve. They're
Mhm.
typically excellent at one or two problems that they solve and serviceable on the rest. And the challenge comes in where that's true of all of them, but the one or two things that each one is excellent at tend to be a little different, right? So one of them might be great at visualizations, not that great at consolidations.
Yep.
Might be great at multi-currency, whatever you have to do, or headcount analysis, or whatever it is. And there's always that kind of trade-off where you, for your individual situation, really have to prioritize what are the one or two things that I need this thing to hit the ball out of the park on. And then as long as it's serviceable, kind of like you talked about with the skills, right? There are certain table stake skills that we all have to have, right? That's the cost of entry. And then once you have those, then you got to pick which are the skills that I'm going to really invest in getting great at that are going to set me apart. And I totally agree with you on the soft skills. That's where I've focused for the last decade on myself personally, as well as on the topics that I teach. I think that by far, if you do great analysis and have incredible insights, but you can't communicate them in a way that other people understand, or you can't get them to buy into it and actually do something about it to take action on it, then it all falls apart and all that work was a little bit for naught. So it sounds like you've done a lot of work in the past, and it sounds like you're still doing a lot of work evaluating different tools. What are
Mhm.
some of the main categories? Like I mentioned visualizations. What are some of the main, when you're looking at the tools, the main things that are the top things that these tools are best at in most cases?
Yeah, so I'll do 2 things. I'll talk about what I look at it as a pyramid now. I used to look at it as pillars, but I think it's a pyramid. I refer to
Okay.
there's basically 5 levels for FP&A, kind of 4 and then 1 that goes throughout. And so your base of every FP&A tool is the data model. How does it bring in the data? What data can it connect to? How many dimensions? How easy is it to add more, to clean your data, to manage it? Can it do all the variables you need? So really, can it meet your business's need from a data model perspective? And do I have to have a professional services person to maintain it, or can I do it myself? How long is it going to take? So having an understanding of that base layer, your data and what it can integrate with and manage is really where it starts. And then from there, go ahead.
I was going to say, so what I'm hearing there, and I want to make sure that I understand it
Mhm.
correctly before we go on. It sounds like what I'm hearing there is a big chunk of that is the ETL process, right?
Yeah, a big
How
part of
you're
it is, yeah.
getting, yeah, how you're getting the
Mhm.
data in and out of whatever applications you're using. Okay. Just want to make
Yeah,
sure I was
and how
understanding.
much data can it bring in? Is it easy to look at your data at a transactional level? Can it give you can you see customer and vendor and product so you can plan at that level? Or is it limited in what you can bring in? So that's the first
Gotcha.
part, and then on top of it is really your forecasting, your modeling layer. Are you using Microsoft Excel as that layer, which some tools do, or Google Sheets, or do they have their own syntax? How easy is it to learn? Can it really support my business? Can I plan the way I need to? So first, if it says yes, I can get all the data I need in, I can have all the dimensions and those variables and everything I need to plan at whatever level it is and to do my reporting and everything. That next question is, can it really support my modeling? And if I make changes, is it easy enough to learn that I can do it myself? Or am I going to again go back to a professional service person every time I want to make a change? If I hire somebody new, are they never going to be able to understand it because the syntax is so complex that it's just like good luck. You need the PhD
Yeah.
person. That's the next level. And then when you go one level up, you really get into your reporting and your dashboarding. Oh, and there's a lot of options there. Some tools try to be very strong and try to be a visualization tool. There's a
Yeah.
number of tools now that are built on Power BI, built on Click. So they're first a BI tool and they've added planning on top of it. Those are going to be great for visualization, but they're generally not going to be as good at the modeling. It's
Right.
trade offs. It's like you said, rarely is a tool best at everything. It's one thing
Yeah.
it's really good at, and we know what that
Yep.
is for Power BI. And so you have your dashboard and reporting, and then that top layer is approval, workflow, commenting. Can I send out messages to Slack? Can I comment at a line item and a point level? Can I assign different approvers to this process? All those type of things. And so that's really what I think of as the pyramid, because that base is the modeling, whether it's the data model or the financial modeling. And then how are they thinking about AI and using that machine learning throughout the tool? Can I use predictive algorithms? Do they have any generative AI? Are they doing anomaly detection? All those things that make my life easier and don't require me to sort through a ton of data. How are
Yeah.
they thinking about those? So that's how I think about a tool in general. And then you get into the things you mentioned, which how do they do on consolidation and multi-currency? And I think of those are more specific things you need the tool to do. Those are more
Right.
requirements than that broad picture of how do I think about planning tools in general and what's important within a tool.
Yep. That's a great framework. That's hopefully everybody else finds that as useful as I do, because that to me is simple, it's clear, and I think it's a smart approach when you're looking at the different tools that are out there. When you were coming up in your career, if you think about early in your career and today, it's such a different world in terms of I know early in my career, if you wanted any kind of professional development, you really had to search it out, right? It was few and far between. It was like the American Management Association, maybe state CPA societies might have some stuff on financial analysis. 20, 30 years ago, there wasn't much out there that was easily accessible.
Yep,
Today, we almost have the reverse problem where there's
I
so
would
much
agree.
stuff out there, you have to filter through. That's part of what I'm hoping to do with this podcast and some of the other stuff I'm doing is to help sift through and curate that stuff. When you're talking to folks out there that feel like they're awash in options, what are some of the maybe principles or frameworks that you might use? Just put a screen on things and go, all right, how do I filter through the stuff that's out there to know what I should be investing my time and my money in?
Yeah, so I'm gonna take that answer and speak to it for planning tools because I think I have a framework that works well.
Okay.
Beyond what I just mentioned, the second thing of how I like to segment the market is you first start with, okay, are you in that small, medium, or enterprise? Like, how big are you? Or a couple hundred? How fast are you growing? Because there are completely different tools. If you look
Yeah.
at planning and analytics by IBM, I know of use cases where they're doing, I think it was 6 or 6.5 terabytes of just in memory to support the calculations they're doing. A tool that supports 300 people, there's not a chance in the world that they're going to have that kind of power.
Yeah.
So at first, you just got to know where your size is and have a general idea of who fits in there. And then the second thing of where I like to break it up into is I break it into kind of three categories, and within one of those categories, some subcategories. So first, there's these integrated planning tools. If you really want to stay in BI, does that make sense? That's what you want, you know it. Then you got a small subset you can look at. Then you can start saying, okay, which ones support the different sizes of the market and narrow that list down. On the opposite end of that, you got the BI. Next, you have what I call as a spreadsheet replacement. You want to get rid of spreadsheets altogether. No matter what, every tool is going to have a little bit of that. But something like an Anaplan or a Pigment that's really designed to replace your spreadsheet as much as possible, or a Causal, those are others. Then
Mhm.
from there, you have just the general web apps, and they all have different levels of integration with Excel. So do you want something that kind of has a high level of integration or a really low level? And then below that, you have what I'll call spreadsheet native. They're still technically web apps, but they basically use spreadsheets as their calculation engine. So you're learning almost no new syntax. Yes, there might be a little bit, but they allow you to stay in Google Sheets. They allow you to stay in Excel, and they give you all the database stuff you need, the enterprise stuff to support your tool. And so
Mhm.
that's usually what I'll tell people. And then it gets beyond that. If I know somebody that's mostly on-prem and they're big or really big, I'm going to say, okay, there's probably a few options in the third generation you're mostly going to want to go with some of the older tools because they're going to be more familiar with on-prem and have done a lot more implementations in that space. So then it starts getting down into more things and what's important to them. And you can start narrowing down to at least give them a list of 5, maybe 10 tools that, hey, here's some tools you'll want to consider instead of going out there and looking at G2 and getting a list of 80 tools and going, what do I do?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges I see. Like when you look on LinkedIn and you see some of the content people are putting out, these 100-point checklists, and I look at them and I go, this is great. More so, I think, for someone that's a little earlier in their career that maybe doesn't really have a good, clear picture of the big picture of all of the different things that you need to
Yeah.
know. But as you start to get a little bit more experience, I think it becomes a little more valuable to have that more curated type of content, whether it be courses or whatever it is, where you're really honing in on a small number of things that you want to really get good at. And actually, with that in mind, one of the things you talked about the soft skills being really important. I'm a huge believer that communication is almost without question, in my mind, just my opinion, the most important skill. However, before you get to communicating, one of the things you need to get good at in FP&A is actually developing insights from the analysis that you're doing. Before you communicate, here's what I recommend or here's what I'm observing, you have to actually come up with that insight. What are your thoughts on some things that FP&A people can do to get better at that actual skill of developing insights from their analysis?
Yeah. So I think there's definitely frameworks that could help. I think the one thing FP&A needs to spend a lot more time on is understanding the problem. We love to get our hands on the data, and often haven't defined the problem. Steve Jobs said, it was something to the effect that if you define the problem well enough, you almost have the solution. Abraham
Okay.
Lincoln said, look, if you give me an hour to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend 45 minutes sharpening the axe. So
Yeah.
really, I think one of the biggest things FP&A needs to learn is to step back and really think about the problem, how you're going to design things, how you're going to go about it. Sometimes needing a hypothesis, right? There's a lot of stuff you can take from science of steps they follow. There's a
Mhm.
lot of decision making frameworks. And I think stepping back and implementing whichever one works for you, there's a number of them, but making sure you start with the question and design. Like take financial modeling, for an example. You've seen, I'm sure, plenty of horrible financial models where you're like, who thought this was a good way to build it? Yeah, you're laughing because
Yeah.
you were in M&A, right? I know you've seen that. The biggest problem there
I've
is
created some too, by
design.
the way.
I have too. I've created what I call Franken models. I've created some monsters
Yeah.
in my day. But if you learn good design principles and you start with design and really think about what you're trying to solve and how you lay it out properly, you can avoid 80% of those problems. And I think that's true with analysis and learning to provide insights is just spend more time really understanding the problem. Then after
Yep.
that, try to pick a framework and stick with it. You got problem solving decision making as a framework. You have the whole what, now what, so what,
So
which I
what?
really
Yeah.
like for like variance commentary. Okay, I got the basics down. But why does that matter? And what do I do going forward? And so I think
Yep.
stepping through a framework is one of I think the best things you can do and spend more time on the question.
Yeah, the first part of that actually, as you were explaining that reminded me of do you watch that TV show Shark Tank?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, one of my favorite shows, and you will see occasionally where someone that did not understand the problem or define the problem very well, they'll go through their whole presentation of, "This is our product, and this is the
Hmm.
economics of the business," and all this stuff, and then one of the sharks will chime in and say, "You have an elegant solution for a problem that doesn't exist." They thought they
Yeah.
built a better mousetrap or some new thing, and then the shark makes them realize that I could solve this same problem 5 different ways with cheaper, easier solutions. So you've come up with this elegant solution, but it's not really necessary. And it's
Yes.
because they didn't spend enough time on that very first step of it. I think the second step you talked about frameworks. I have found it's almost baffling to me how many people, when I ask them the question, do you have a framework that you use for making important decisions? And most people can't articulate anything that actually is a framework. They'll articulate something, but if you step back and you look at it from the outside, there's not much of a framework to it. it seems like they're winging it all the time. And then if you ask the question, how do you determine if a decision is good? What do you think the number one answer most people say is?
Go with their gut.
Re- Most people, if you ask them, how do you judge the goodness of a decision? Most people will say results, right? And
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I used to work in work environments where there was a mantra, we don't care about anything but results, right? And I don't know if you've ever read Annie Duke's book, Thinking in Bets, but she talks
I know
about
who she is, but I haven't read the book.
so she was a PhD student. She was finishing up her PhD, and then she became a professional gambler, won
Yep.
millions of dollars,
Mhm.
won the World Series of Poker, and then tied the two together in this book called Thinking in Bets, where she talks about how gambling is very
Yeah.
similar to business decisions, right? There's a lot of
Yep.
missing information, a lot of misinformation, a lot of misdirection sometimes. And without some real good frameworks for how you make decisions and evaluate decisions, you're winging it all the time, which can give you mixed results. Those are really helpful, though. One other thing I want to ask you about, and then we'll wrap up here because I want to respect everybody's time. One of the things that I think some people find to be a little bit nebulous is when people talk about business acumen. How do you look at what business acumen is? What do you include in that sort of basket of what you define as business acumen for starters?
Yeah, I'm one of those that probably thinks it's a little nebulous. It's hard, right? It's a
Yeah,
squishy term. What does it mean? What is really business acumen? But I think business acumen starts with a few things. I think it starts with understanding the business or the industry you're looking. The deeper your knowledge, the better off you are, whether you're working in FP&A or operations or whatever. I think that deep understanding helps. Then it's being able to think strategically, potentially assign frameworks to things, think critically. I think that's really business acumen. They're usually people that can take something complex, apply a heuristic or a couple simple rules, and boil it down to what the essence of the problem is. So then
yeah,
you can start to address it. And often I think people who have good business acumen are also willing to take calculated risks. And I like to say calculated because it's just not willy-nilly. Yeah, let's just try this. Let's try that. But they
right.
realize sometimes just doing something is better than doing nothing, even if it is wrong, and making more decisions because more decisions gives you more opportunity to be right. And most decisions that you're wrong on are usually not crucial. There are a few, and you should give more thought to those. But I think people who have that ability within them and have those frameworks and that way of thinking, I would say typically have a good business acumen. And I'm going to trust them for advice and as potential business partners and people that I think will be successful.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the song, but there's a Rush song with a lyric, something along the lines of, even if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. And
First concert I ever went to was Rush. There you go.
okay, do you remember what song that is? I don't.
I don't remember the song,
Okay,
unfortunately. My brother's a huge Rush fan, so he took me to the concert when I was a kid because
cool.
he
I've
had an
actually
extra.
never seen them live, but
Yeah, I got to
yeah,
see him
they're.
live in the old Salt Palace in Salt Lake. Doesn't even exist anymore. But
Oh wow, yeah. I think my first concert actually was in a place that doesn't exist anymore too, in Fort Lauderdale.
when they could smoke, so it was just indoors. So it was just a big, huge plume of smoke for the couple hours.
Yeah, concerts were very different back in the day compared to how they are today. Actually, on both ends of the spectrum. Some things
Yes,
were a little crazier. Some things were less crazy. Just so many things like that are very different. One last
agreed.
question, then, and then let's wrap up here. Like I said, I want to respect everybody's time here. One of the things that I think people can struggle with, especially with the incredible amount of information that's out there, is having some kind of a plan or a framework for how do I stay on top of things in terms of all the different developments that are going on in FP&A and finance in general. Do you have any type of a plan for how you stay up to date on all the latest and greatest things that are important in FP&A?
I don't have anything like that I could really articulate as a plan when we talked about that when you ask someone making a decision. So I try to stay current on Excel. I clearly have a plan to stay current on the software that's out there. Beyond that, I'm a member of AFP. I try to go to their annual conference. I know a lot of the other content creators and I'll see their content and read it. I think what helps me too is I'm fortunate enough to get to talk to some of the best and brightest minds in the world in FP&A. So preparing ththose interviews allows me to stay current. So really, I don't have a plan per se, but because of what I do for my job and because of the passions I have around Excel and software tools and those things, it allows me to stay current just by the fact of who I'm talking to and what I'm doing, but I don't have the set plan. So I think for anyone, it
Yeah.
starts with what are the most important things that you want to stay current on? Is it around accounting rules? Is it around Excel? Is it around the soft skills? Is it around how people are thinking about forecasting? And then finding some resources because we're in a wash of data and resources.
Yep.
Whatever you want to learn about, it's going to be out there. You just got to find a good source.
Yep. Yeah, that's actually one of the things I'm hoping to bring to the table with this podcast is to help curate that for folks by the people that I invite to be on as guests. And that actually is probably my best advice for that too, is figure out who are the people who are most expert in the things you want to get better at. And most, not all of them, but most of them are putting out content in social media. And if they
Mhm.
are, find a way to connect with them and start building relationships with those people. Kind of like that thing I was saying earlier about I learned more in the hallways outside of meetings than I did in the meetings
Yeah.
from those little conversations that then eventually turned into relationships.
The
Well,
meeting between the meetings, so to speak.
exactly. Exactly. All right, man, let's go ahead and wrap up and tell everybody what is the best way for them to find you if they want to reach out to you and where can they find not just you how to contact you, but also how to access all the stuff that you're putting out.
Yeah, so the best place is probably to start with LinkedIn. You can go to linkedin.com. You can also go to my website, thefpnaguy.com. You can reach out to me directly. People can email me. It's pbarnhurst at thefpnaguy.com. If it's podcasts you're interested in, just type my name in on any podcast platform and you'll find the shows that I have.
Awesome. All right. So if you are not already following Paul and tuning into all the stuff that he puts out a ton of free content and really good meat on the bone stuff, not just fluffy fluff stuff, which there's a lot of that out there as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thanks very much for your time, Paul. Look forward to talking to you again, and we will see you guys in our next episode. See you then.